Today is Friday, May 22nd, 2020. 2 months under semi-lockdown. The number of average cases in San Diego has leveled off to about 1,000 a day on average. So hopefully that won't go up now that the economy is opening up. The unemployment rate hit 30% this past week. That's a lot of folks without jobs. So with prayers to all of them, and there we go, but for the grace of God. Something interesting happened today. You see on the screen a picture of a blue jay. The blue jays have taken roost in this area. They like our oak trees for all the acorns, which they harvest in the fall. Of course, they love the grapes. And the problem with the blue jay is that the moment a grape turns the slightest shade of pink, they are probing and testing the grapes to see if they're ripe. So they are a real nemesis. You do not want blue jays nesting in your vineyard. Well, I've got them all around the area. And this one in particular was touting the cat several times earlier this morning, and me as well. And just at the bottom of the driveway on this pole and flying closer to us. So I don't know what's up with this guy. We're not feeding him or anything, but he's there. Now we're at a time where we have a peace treaty with the birds, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So what I've decided to do is, because life is uncertain, I'm going to be skipping around a little bit and reading the chapters that I like, because who knows if I'll be around to read the whole book. It's quite long. So I'm going to do the birdcatcher and then deal with some other chapters soon thereafter that I like, just in case. Who knows what could happen. So let's get started. We're at chapter 38, the birdcatcher. And let's just bring that up. Here we go. And we'll begin. "Would you mind getting rid of that?" Sheila asked, pointing to a bird's nest in the eaves. "Let me see if there are any eggs." Paul placed the ladder against the house's white adobe bricks. Now that part of the driveway was steep, and the ladder wasn't level, so as he climbed, he made sure to touch the outcrop of brick with 4 fingers in case the ladder toppled. He reached the top step, peered into the nest, saw no egg, and as he descended, the ladder twisted, and he was hurled towards the large glass window. He missed, hanging from one arm. He dropped to the ground without twisting a limb. "There's an egg in the nest," he lied, because she wouldn't destroy a nest with an egg, fearing bad luck. Unknown to her, Paul had negotiated a secret peace treaty with the birds, allowing them to nest under the roof, provided they vacate before a fire season, so he could clean out their empty nest. He always wanted a bird as a child, and now had a bird production line at his house. "If you save a bee, you save humanity," Paul said whenever he found a bee stranded on the property. "If you save a bird, do you save mankind?" Each morning, as Paul and Bluey stepped outside, they were greeted by chirps and songs of friendly birds. Bluey's feathered friend was a flicker named Cheeky, because of the cheeky cry he made, to which Bluey responded with friendly "good morning" barks. Woof woof. The vineyard was a bird sanctuary 10 months each year. Paul welcomed hummingbirds, because the first fish he ever caught was the moment a hummingbird hovered next to him. In the bird landscape, hummingbirds were the good guys, preferring the nectar of flowers to grapes. Territorial by nature and as full of spunk as the pug that challenges a pit bull, hummingbirds nesting in vineyards kept grape-eating birds away. Blue jays, on the other hand, tested grapes the moment they showed the first shade of purple and made plans for family picnics as the grapes grew sweeter. Their favorites were hawks, who nested near the top of the mountain. Sheila and Paul looked forward each year to watching parent hawks teach their young to fly. With screeches louder than Paul's shouts at Kate, "Be careful!" and "Watch out!" the first time he gave her the car's steering wheel. The annual truce continued through spring as a menagerie of birds nested in the vineyard. For Bluey, however, birds were fair game, and a nest with hatchlings a savior treat. Paul located nests by watching where Bluey stopped, sniffed, and stood still, for this dog rarely stopped moving except when he found a bird's nest. When Bluey went missing, there were two places to look: under the apple tree or under a bird's nest. If he returned with feathers poking out the side of his mouth, that was proof where he had been. Carrie Ann hung dispensers of liquid sugar in her vineyard to encourage hummingbirds to nest as a deterrent against other birds. When her grapes were ripe, she played recordings of distressed bird calls and cougar growls that caused blue jays and other grape eaters to hesitate before entering her territory. Those sounds were more neighbor-friendly than cannon and shotgun blasts heard at large vineyards up north. As for Paul and Sheila, whose microclimate above other vineyards resulted in warmer spring temperatures, their grapevines were the first to bud break and first to pick as summer waned, their early harvest indicative of the Tempranillo grape they adored, Tempranillo meaning early in Spanish. The birds knew their grapes were first to ripen and gathered on the perimeter to pounce as the couple deployed conventional weapons to protect them, nets, while Bluey patrolled the rows searching for feathered invaders above the cordon wire as Karl Rove, the neighbor's cat, prowled below. Veraison, or veraison, the rite of passage, puberty of the grape, the slow swelling of breasts, emergence of a dark Bermuda Triangle that will swallow 1,000 ships. The darkening of the grapes starts as teenage candy, pink and rose jelly beans resembling pastel marbles. Though far from mature ripeness of womanhood's pure chocolate, these grapes are no longer little girls. They are flirtatious, as wolves wet their lips, watching them ripen. The outspoken grape who becomes too purple too fast is a pioneer in unexplored territory, attracting too much attention and untimely pecked. Death's puncture, one single beak prick, ruination, with no hope for redemption. Afterwards, a bee might nibble some nectar, and ants will clean up, leaving the skin. Paul said dried berries and skins add phenolic material to the soup and included these in the harvest so long as they didn't smell like vinegar or mold, whereas Joe the wino employed a dozen migrants to inspect each and every grape before it went into the crusher, and any grapes suspected of kissing birds were plucked from the assembly line and discarded. Who was right? Taste their wines and decide for yourself. It was said Joe grew the best Brunello in all San Diego County, and those who made wine from his grapes said it was the best-selling wine in their tasting rooms. About Paul's Tempranillo that seduced birds, bees, and men, it made women cry as they remembered adventures in Spain. Perhaps it would have tasted better if the dried, damaged fruit were discarded, or perhaps it would have lost some character. Which winemaker was correct? Yes. Midsummer morning, Paul walked through the vineyard for his daily inspection and noticed 2 berries untimely plucked from the bunch, with a tiny pool of grape juice left behind as a clue. These were not menstruating grapes. Their skins had been punctured. He pulled out his camera to photograph the scene of the crime and told Sheila it was time to prepare the nets. Like the first pop of popcorn, purple grapes were popping up all over the Tempranillo block. It was veraison, the purpling of the grapes in time to hang nets, for a blushing berry, even though sour, was a temptation for birds with grape expectations. The first steps were to trim the vines and lay out the nets, and as Paul climbed the mountain with Bluey, he heard a message. A shoot cut from the vine withers and dies on the ground. Live your life rooted to the vine. He wrote down this verse to include in the Gospel according to Dog. Miguel walked down rows with his clippers, snip, 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 he and his crew giving Joe's vines a crew cut. Sheila called it a buzz cut or military cut, and as she appreciated finely hedged vines, was all in favor and requested Paul do the same to hers, the cut facilitating stretching nets over the rows. Rodrigo, about 6'4" tall, made the task of pulling nets over vines go faster, allowing the shorter Miguel to supervise with his soulmate, Corona. As the crew netted, they called out to each other in operatic vineyard recitative. Ranchero Chida! Sang refrains from the latest narco mariachi songs and told tales of recent conquest. I have a little senorita in Tijuana, Miguel crooned. She's so pretty and nice. Fatter than a cow, Pedro said to Rodrigo. Miguel trimmed vines without regard for the canes needed for next year's grapes or the number of leaves necessary for photosynthesis to achieve perfect ripeness. Joe, who also admired neatly hedged vines, didn't mind, but Paul wouldn't allow Miguel to touch his vines when it was time to net because he didn't want Miguel pruning damaging them. Sheila was shorter than Miguel and had trouble reaching above the top wire, so her trimming technique wasn't much better and sometimes worse, but at least she considered the canes needed next year. Paul suggested a division of labor in which he judiciously trimmed each cane and Sheila used her favorite tool, a 3-foot stake, to cast nets over the vines. Paul said his approach would result in riper fruit and better tasting wine than Joe's. When he and Sheila adopted side netting, where the nets only covered the fruit zone and were fastened midway up the vine's sides, they didn't need to give them a haircut, so Paul let them be. As Paul trimmed, he inspected the clusters, and if a vine was overcropped, that is, carrying too much fruit, he would drop a cluster. Dropping fruit was done to achieve better ripeness and improve flavor, because Paul was in the business of growing wine, not maximizing fruit output. Paul, conflicted by the thought of wasting dropped fruit, mixed tart juice from underripe grapes with olive oil and Dijon mustard as a dressing for salads and dipping sauce for pan-fried gyoza. That was an easy meal to cook when Sheila asked, "What's for dinner?" And wine was not the correct answer to maintain cordial conjugal relations. On a foggy, mid-July morning, temperature started at 58 Fahrenheit degrees and the work went fast. The fog slid down the mountain and as the sky cleared, the sun beat down on hard clay, and by early afternoon the outside temperature was 85, and you could heat a tortilla on the ground. Paul pulled the long bull cane of a vine to trim, then saw a nest and feathers, and observed terms of the peace treaty, and let it be. He sat on the ground fastening nets around the trunk of each vine, 2 ties, one on each side, because birds entered nets from the bottom and searched for gaps at the trunk. He felt Mother Earth's warmth on his rear and heard the call of nature's heat pad to lie down, rest, and release his troubles. He removed his gloves and felt her heat with his bare hands, and she was hot but not burning, and he pressed his back against her, and the warmth of the earth soothed his back, and he looked up at the blue sky and closed his eyes with hat over his face and lay a few minutes, letting the warmth relax his muscles, Mother Earth's fingers massaging, kneading his back, inviting him to sleep. A voice told him to get up. It wasn't time to sleep, but he couldn't move. And the voice told him again to get up, and he felt himself swallowed by the earth. Having re-entered the womb, he didn't want to leave. And the voice called a third time, and he opened his eyes and felt Bluey's wet tongue lick his face. "What did I do to deserve this punishment?" Paul asked, recalled many reasons, and got back to work. Bluey ambled to a patch of shade, turned towards Paul to make sure he was in sight, then rested his head upon his paws. "Some working dog you are," Paul scolded. Bluey was pulled to magnetic shade, and Paul wished the Aussie could discover underground water as well as he found the shadows of trees. When Paul netted vines, he did so as assisting a lover dressed before a special evening. He unfurled her fishnet stockings, carefully pulled them over her toes, across the bottom of her feet, giving her a soft tickle over her heels and up her calves, filling the stockings with her skin, her flesh, her strength, and covering her fruit with proper modesty. Dressing vines in lingerie reminded him of the promise to come, the day of undressing, with her full fruit at its ripest, and how he would remove the nets as delicately and affectionately as he would her stockings, starting at her waist, sliding slowly over the curves of her hips, unveiling the full glory of her fruit, whispering, "I'll be back in a minute," pulling the lace below her thighs, below her calves, over her heels, kissing the bottoms of her feet and then the tops of her toes, nibbling softly, as deftly as he peeled the skin of a Tempranillo grape with his teeth. As Paul netted, the loves of his life flashed before his eyes: Rachel, her moist palms; Christine, the opera; Jane, her bodily sense, until snapped out of his reverie by a barking dog demanding a stick. He barked again, and Paul threw it. The dog picked it up and carried it to the shade, and as Paul reverted to a reverie of lace and stockings, his wife toiled and finished netting the Tempranillo and Petite Sirah blocks by herself, while he worked in an air-conditioned office in town, or was on the road delivering wine to teachers in exchange for hugs. "It's so hot," Sheila complained. "I'm tired." "Why don't you hire a guy to help?" So she called Miguel, who sent over a guy experienced picking citrus, where towering orange, satsuma, and kumquat trees provided shade. He arrived at 7:30 a.m., and it was already warm, and she showed him how to bend down and tie the nets. After an hour, she noticed him tying while sitting, and at 9:30 a.m. he announced, "It's too hot. I'm leaving." "But I have to get these vines netted before the birds attack. May I come over tomorrow?" "All right, but let's start earlier when it's cooler." The next morning, he arrived at 6 a.m., and Paul greeted him with a pot of strong pressed coffee, and after he went off to his air-conditioned office, Citrus Guy went into the vineyard with Sheila. She hung nets while he tied the bottoms. By 7:30 a.m., he was tying sitting down, and at 8 a.m., he told her it was too hot to work and left. Sheila telephoned Miguel incensed because she had hired a worker to help her precisely because it was hot. "What's wrong with your guys? Don't they want to work?" "He's not used to working with grapes," explained Miguel. So he sent over Rodrigo, who was accustomed to the heat, and together, he and Sheila finished netting the Zinfandel block in a day, and the Aglianico block the next. Sheila left the Grenache grapes for Paul to net over the weekend, since those grapes were his, and they were starting to turn faint shades of cotton candy. Every decision, every action in a vineyard has consequences, some predictable, others unforeseen. When Paul let the vines grow long in some areas, overhanging shoots shaded the grapes, which prevented sunburn, and the extra leaves encouraged photosynthesis. On the other hand, with all those extra leaves blocking sunlight, mold and fungus set in, and so, at harvest, when he went to pick the beautiful-looking grapes, on inspection, they were, surprise, surprise, rotten. In farming, there's always something. The next season, Paul purchased 24 8-foot metal stakes, fit those inside the vineyard mobile, and in the more vigorous areas, inserted a stake to raise the trellis top wire beyond his reach, pinching the wires just 4 inches apart, letting the vine shoot straight upright, allowing grapes to get the perfect amount of airflow and sun. He was retrofitting a vertical positioning system, which Miguel should have installed at first in vigorous parts of their vineyard, strapping up the busty breast of his vineyard beauties. If the grapes didn't get enough light after veraison, Paul was sure to give the vines a modest haircut, not that of his son, now stationed at Camp Pendleton, where he served as one of the few, the brave, the Marines, but the Beatles' mod cut he wanted as a child. About 2 weeks after starting, the netting was finished, except for the block at the top of the hill, the bulk of the work done by Sheila. While Paul worked in an air-conditioned office, their house had no air conditioner except in the garage to keep the ever-increasing stacks of bottled wine from boiling over. "I want to get side nets next year," said Sheila, who had researched netting online. "They're easier to put up and put away." So Paul brought them, only to find 1 year later he came back from a trip. She removed the side nets after harvest. "Why did you take the nets down?" "Mealybugs hide in the nets during winter. "That's ridiculous," said Paul. "Who's going to hang the nets next summer? It's going to be a lot of work." "I don't care. I'll do it," she said, thinking she would hire Rodrigo, who did a good job and worked fast. After more than 20 years of marriage, Paul had learned it was better to be happy than right, so he shut up and would deal with the nets next year. "Which wine would you like for dinner?" he asked to change the topic. Paul walked along each row, looked for damaged grapes, and when he found one, used his fingers to isolate the rotten berry and extracted it carefully. He advanced to using thin clippers as a scalpel, and after performing this operation a dozen times, imagined himself a brain surgeon, skillfully saving patients, making sure not to miss, for one miss would result in paralysis or worse. When demonstrating this technique to Sheila, that's the moment he accidentally snipped a whole healthy cluster prematurely from a cane. Whoops! Collateral damage. Massive malpractice suit. Don't do that again. The difference between life and death is a little snip for a surgeon and a guy and his dog trying to manage a vineyard. "Would you mind not touching my grapes?" Sheila said. "You're doing more damage than the birds." "Even monkeys fall from trees," he answered. They hung a large sign at their vineyard's entrance, "Eat at Joe's," with an arrow pointing to Joe's to encourage birds to dine there. Once all the vintner's vines were covered, the birds returned to dine on Bluey's best, and as July melted into August and the birds became thirstier, the grapes became an irresistible temptation. Carrie Ann figured she'd give the birds water and seed, using the same logic Miguel used to offer water to coyotes to keep them from grapes. When Paul set up a bird feeder, he attracted more birds to his property and found more in the nets, and there was only one thing to do: call the bird catcher. This character stars in Mozart's opera The Magic Flute, carrying a net, singing in search of birds and maidens. Der Vogelfänger bin ich, ja, stets lustig, Hesso Hoppasa, ich Vogelfänger bin bekannt bei alt und jung ganzem Land. To which Paul ad-libbed to the sounds of Mozart. I am the vintner of this land, protecting grapes from birds. I must release the feathered thieves before dogs choose their heads. And when the grapes are all safe, I'll make the world's best wine. And all the girls in all the world will line up to drink mine. And once they sip the magic wine, all netted birds I'll free. They'll fly and sing above the vines, and the best girl will be mine. Da 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 da. Her sweet kiss will be mine. Now, if Mozart, in all his genius, created a charming character who catches and cuddles women with bird netting, it's not bizarre Paul imagined dressing women's legs with said netting. The vines make men crazy, and whenever he found a curiously colored feather while singing to the birds, he added it to the collection of plumage stuck in his hat, which by harvest was adorned with beautiful yellow, blue, orange, white, and brown feathers. Some birds didn't get the message, or flat out ignored warnings the nets were a field of danger, and only the bird catcher offered rescue. He admonished first-time offenders, "Don't come back," when releasing them. Of course, with intelligence limited by their bird brains, they scoffed at his warning and bragged about their harrowing escape and how good the grapes tasted. Word spread quickly about the Tempranillo, the ripest grapes in all San Diego County, and the most delicious. The dog of women and men who wouldn't bite through the fur of a baby bunny switched from herding mode to bird dog mode and searched and destroyed birds trapped in the nets, a sign of his dogmanity. He trotted down rows of vines listening for the frantic flutter of flapping wings trying to escape death by canine. He became known as the Dog Father, the enforcer, and woe to any birds caught in the nets. The bird catcher needed to rescue birds from Bluey and Karl Rove's incisors as much as from exposure and dehydration. Meantime, birds flew overhead, searching for an opening to penetrate and attack. the smallest sparrows and sleek yellowbirds exploiting the tiniest of holes. A single bird might damage a grape or two on multiple clusters before surprised by the arrival of the birdcatcher who would save them, or Bluey, who showed as much mercy as a Terminator. They never heard Karl Rove coming. Their terror short-lived, as feline fangs were the last thing they felt when clutched by claws and ripped, a nightmare Carrie-Anne imagined for herself. The birdcatcher discovered his Hund left a peculiar signature when he found a small pool of blood under a vine, noticed a drip, looked up, and saw a decapitated bird's torso hanging from the nets, the work of the dog-father, protecting his territory. Guilt proven when Paul plucked feathers from Bluey's snout. One morning, making the rounds, Paul heard Bluey barking, and when he caught up to the dog, found a pair of unusual-looking birds that didn't belong in the nets. "Swallows! What are you doing here? You're not grape eaters!" Paul untied the bottoms of the nets and escorted the frightened birds to the exits, inviting them to make their home in the empty mud nest under the eaves of the winery, which faced the ocean. The swallows were grateful to the strange human with feathers in his cap they observed helping birds, and sensing the idyllic surroundings, took Paul up on his offer and made their home at Blue Merle, returning year after year each spring, blessing the home with their auspicious presence. Paul picked up 2 feathers they left behind, inserting them into his cap. The next day the birdcatcher discovered a large yellow bird and was struck by his beauty. "How did you get in here?" He was double the size of a sparrow and fluttered and squawked as Paul approached. "The Lord watches over the feather of the tiniest sparrow," he said, trying to recall a Bible verse. As the bird flapped, he became tangled and pecked Paul's ungloved hand with his sharp beak. "Ow! I'm trying to help you!" If Paul pulled too hard, he might literally pull the bird's leg from his socket. He left the bird to walk down to the house for scissors, and shooed away Karl Rove when he returned just in time. With tiny scissors he had used to trim the nails of his infant children, and with the skill of a brain surgeon, Paul snipped the net and released the bird into the air with the customary, "Don't come back!" Summer wore on. San Diego's Papageno dreamed of catching his Papagena, and Sheila strung out nets along the ground at the top of the hill, preparing to net the last block of vines, finally turning purple. She left the nets on the ground to finish the task in the cool of the morning, and joined Paul and Bluey at the house for a chilled glass of blush wine. Merlot Mac had given them a dormant vine cutting they stuck into the ground at the top of the summit. It grew into the longest vine of the property, almost 30 feet, loaded with Merlot clusters. After Paul drove to work, Sheila walked with Bluey to the top of the hill, and while he trotted to the shade under his favorite bougainvillea, she pulled the net under this Merlot and jumped at the rattle. She implored Bluey to come back right away, but he said the snake can... she implored Paul to come back right away, but he said the snake can wait, urging her to bring Bluey to another part of the property and work there. How do you remove a live rattlesnake from bird netting without a shotgun or shovel? If death isn't an option, is not killing the rattlesnake you captured pissing into the wind? After you let it go, what are the odds it'll come back to bite you, or worse, your dog? "Don't kill it," Sheila pleaded when Paul returned. "The last time you killed the snake, I ended up in the hospital. Who knows what'll happen to Alex in Iraq if you kill the snake?" "I promise I won't kill it." And he took his trusty shovel and marched up the hill, wishing Alex was with him. As Paul approached the net by the large Merlot, he heard the warning, "Don't tread on me," and saw the snake had tried to pass through the netting, just like a bird. He could cut out the viper from the nets, but didn't see how he could remove the net from around its throat. It was one thing to be pecked by a bird, another thing to be holding a large rattlesnake with one hand while cutting string around its head with the other. There was only one thing to do. He called Snake Man, who rushed over. "What kind of snake is this?" Paul asked the herpetologist. "I've never seen anything like her. She's a beautiful creature," he said. "She remembers Crotatalis organis helleri, a southern Pacific rattlesnake, but she's albino. I've never seen a white snake here." "The only time I've seen a white snake is at the opera," said Paul. "What? Never mind." They discussed a plan for freeing the viper. The snake was located on a hill without solid footing, so they needed to move her to a flatter area. Snake Man pinned her head to the ground with a handheld hoe, while Paul cut her from the net. Free, she coiled, hissed, and shook her booty, cocked and ready to strike. Snake Man deftly lifted her up with his hoe and walked along the vines in sandals to the dirt road, skillfully managing the serpent, as Paul studied the moves and techniques of this master snake charmer, who could have easily slipped into her gaping mouth. "She's a fine-looking creature." "How do you know she's a she?" asked Paul. "Look there," he said, pointing towards the tail. "The distance between the vent and the rattle is small. Yes, sir, she's a real beauty." On the flatter dirt road, Snake Man once again pinned the viper's head as Paul carefully cut more of the net from her body. Still, the head was constricted, and Snake Man would not release her into the wild like that, which would be a death sentence. With the powerful animal wiggling, Paul couldn't slip the scissors blade under the remaining net strings without puncturing her skin. Darkness was falling. "Let's take her to the animal shelter where they can anesthetize her and remove the net safely," Paul suggested. "They don't take rattlesnakes." "Then let's anesthetize her ourselves." "How?" asked Snake Man. "Pack her in ice." "That might work. That will work," said Paul, remembering Carrie Ann's story about a rattlesnake roundup in Texas, where a fellow put a snake he caught into a freezer. When he removed it later to cook, the snake thawed and struck. If they packed the snake overnight in ice, her reptilian body would cool down and go into hibernation, and they could safely remove the net. Snake Man lifted the rattler with his hoe into an empty 32-gallon container, while Paul fastened the lid, creating a new hybrid rhythm instrument, part drum, part rattle, as she voiced extreme displeasure. They agreed to meet at 6 a.m. the next morning. Meantime, Paul drove to the deli, purchased 3 bags of ice, returned to the container, and slowly poured ice cubes as the snake rattled and eventually became quiet. Friends, please use caution when opening an unknown container on a neighbor's property in the country. How many hours does it take for a snake on ice to chill out? Unsure of the answer, Paul walked up to the top of the hill with his shovel, where he found Snake Man enjoying the sunrise of Zen. Paul dumped the container and out slid the ice with the snake on top, moving but more lethargic than the evening before. "She's a magnificent specimen," said Snake Man, who scooped her up, brought her to an area free of ice, and pinned her head against the ground, this time her body docile. Paul brought safety scissors he used to trim the nails of his children as babies. He gently nudged the blade against the skinned snake under the tight net, and with the skill of a surgeon snipped. She was free, almost. "She's too cold," observed Snake Man. "We can't leave her immobile out here during the day, or a predator will get her. Let her thaw out in the container and release her when you get home from work." Once again, Snake Man lifted the chilled viper with his snake charmer's tool into the brute container, and Paul replaced the lid, warning Sheila not to put leaves into that container and to keep Bluey away. As the sun was setting, Sheila finished netting the merlot and other vines at the top of the hill, while Paul carried the improvised maraca to the Valley of Death, pulled off the lid, kicked over the container, and stood back as a very pissed-off woman emerged, expressing her displeasure. The good news was the snake was fine. Most snakes would scurry away, but this snake hung around and hissed, wanting to talk. Paul took Sheila's favorite tool, the 3-foot wooden stake she used to hang nets, and prodded the snake to go away. She curled into a spool of white rope and cocked her head, rattled, hissed, and lunged, but fell short as Paul stood back. He stick-handled her down into the canyon, and with a final "Don't come back!" She slowly slithered down and coiled, backslid some more, then coiled, not wanting to leave. Paul returned to the house to fetch Bluey, and together they walked to the top of the hill to help Sheila clean up, without mentioning he used her favorite tool as a snake prod. The snake was heavenly white, and she carried on a conversation.